when he was stuck creatively. He would come into the room, in my room in the house, and he would say, "Has anything interesting happened to you lately?" So I knew he was stuck. He was looking for something to do. But I grew up.
For years, people sensed something was off. The tension was subtle, rarely spoken out loud, but unmistakable to those who paid close attention. Whenever Rob Reiner's name came up, the reaction was cold, distant, sometimes even dismissive. Fans speculated, insiders whispered, but no one could ever point to a clear reason. It simply became one of Hollywood's quiet mysteries. Why did he utterly hate Rob Reiner? The truth is, this wasn't about a single argument or a personality clash blown out of proportion. It was something deeper. Something that built slowly behind the scenes, far from cameras and red carpets. What made it more confusing was that both men were respected, successful, and publicly professional. On the surface, there was no scandal. No explosive confrontation. Just an unmistakable wall that never came down. For a long time, that silence protected the story. Hollywood is built on unspoken rules, and one of them is knowing when not to talk. But time has a way of loosening even the tightest restraints. Old loyalties fade. People retire. Perspectives change. And eventually, truths that once felt too risky to share begin to surface. Now, with new context and long overdue clarity, the reason behind that intense resentment finally makes sense. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't ego. And it certainly wasn't something trivial. It was rooted in a moment that altered trust, reshaped relationships, and left a mark that never healed. Once you understand what really happened, the tension no longer feels mysterious. It feels inevitable. The tension didn't explode in public, and that's exactly why it lasted so long. In Hollywood, the most serious conflicts aren't always the loud ones. They're the quiet fractures that form when trust is broken behind closed doors. In this case, the resentment toward Rob Reiner didn't come from competition or creative differences on the surface. It came from something far more personal. A moment where professional respect quietly collapsed. Those who were present during the early stages of their interaction recall an environment that initially felt promising. There was mutual admiration, shared history in the industry, and an assumption that collaboration would be smooth. But somewhere along the way, expectations shifted. Decisions were made without transparency. Conversations that should have happened never did. And for someone who valued loyalty and straightforwardness above all else, that silence felt like betrayal. What made the situation worse was how quickly things moved after that point. Projects evolved, narratives changed, and certain voices suddenly carried more weight than others. To outsiders, it looked like normal industry politics. To the person on the receiving end, it felt like being quietly pushed aside while being expected to smile through it. That kind of experience doesn't just bruise egos, it alters how someone sees people they once respected. Unlike typical Hollywood disputes, this one was never about credit or money. It was about control and acknowledgement. The sense that contributions were minimized, perspectives dismissed, and decisions finalized without honest dialogue created a lasting wound. And because it happened subtly, there was no clean break. No argument to point to. Just an unresolved bitterness that hardened over time. Reiner, known publicly for his confidence and authority, rarely addressed the situation. That absence of explanation only deepened the divide. Silence in moments like these often speaks louder than confrontation. For the other party, it confirmed the fear that the relationship had never been as equal as it seemed. Once that realization sets in, resentment doesn't fade. It settles. People close to the situation have since described the emotional aftermath as exhausting. Every mention of Reiner reopened the same unresolved feelings. Not anger in the explosive sense, but something colder and more enduring. Disappointment, disillusionment, the kind that doesn't need shouting to be felt. Over time, that emotion hardened into something that observers later misread as outright hatred. What's important to understand is that this resentment wasn't impulsive. It was calculated in the sense that it came from reflection, not reaction. There were years to reconsider, reassess, and move on, and yet the feeling remained. That persistence is what makes the story significant. It suggests that whatever happened wasn't minor. It cut at the core of how trust and respect were defined. Hollywood often rewards those who move on quietly, and both men did exactly that. Careers continued. Public appearances remained civil. No interviews turned hostile. But behind that polished surface, the fracture never healed. Those who knew both men could feel it immediately. The avoidance, the guarded tone, the lack of warmth. It wasn't performative. It was genuine. As more time passed, the industry changed. Priorities shifted. And with distance came clarity. The resentment wasn't about Rob Reiner as a public figure. It was about a private moment where expectations were broken and never repaired. That distinction matters. It explains why the feeling never softened with success or age. Understanding this now reframes everything. The cold reactions. The refusal to reconcile. The unmistakable tension that lingered for decades. It wasn't bitterness without cause. It was the result of a trust that was never restored, and a boundary that was quietly, permanently drawn. As the years went on, what made this resentment even more powerful was how deliberately it was handled. There were opportunities to confront the issue, to clear the air, or even to publicly dismiss the tension as exaggerated. None of that happened. Instead, distance became the strategy. Invitations were declined. Shared spaces were avoided. And when circumstances made interaction unavoidable, professionalism replaced warmth. To outsiders, it looked mature. To those who understood the history, it was a clear boundary that had been firmly set. What's important here is the difference between anger and finality. Anger flares up, burns hot, and eventually cools. What existed in this case was something far more settled. It wasn't fueled by emotion anymore. It was sustained by conviction. The belief that once trust is broken in a certain way, it doesn't deserve another chance. That mindset doesn't come from pride. It comes from experience. People close to the situation have said the turning point wasn't the original incident itself, but what followed. The lack of accountability. The absence of acknowledgement. When someone feels wronged, a simple conversation can often prevent lasting damage. Here, that conversation never came. And over time, silence hardened into meaning. It wasn't interpreted as neutrality, it was interpreted as confirmation that the relationship was never truly valued. Hollywood has a unique way of normalizing this kind of behavior. Power shifts quietly. Decisions are reframed as creative choices. Responsibility becomes diffuse. For many, that's just how the industry works. But for someone who entered the relationship believing in mutual respect, that explanation wasn't enough. It felt like an excuse rather than a reason. And once that conclusion was reached, there was no incentive left to pretend otherwise. This is where public perception and private reality sharply diverged. Fans and media often assume strong negative feelings come from jealousy or ego clashes. In this case, now they're applied. There was no attempt to compete, outshine, or undermine. The resentment existed independently of career success. Even as accolades accumulated and reputation solidified, the feeling didn't fade. That alone suggests it wasn't rooted in insecurity. But in principle, another layer that made reconciliation impossible was time. Years passed without resolution, and with each passing year, revisiting the issue felt less necessary. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it had already shaped behavior. The distance became normal. The absence of connection became expected. At a certain point, reopening old wounds feels less like healing and more like disruption. And for someone who had already made peace with the boundary, there was nothing to gain by revisiting it. Observers sometimes mistake this kind of emotional closure for bitterness. In reality, it's often the opposite. It's a form of acceptance. Accepting that not every relationship is meant to be repaired. Accepting that respect doesn't always require reconciliation. And accepting that walking away can be healthier than pretending nothing happened. That clarity can look cold from the outside, but internally, it's often a relief. Rob Reiner's continued silence on the matter only reinforced this stance. Not because silence is inherently wrong, but because in this context it mirrored the original issue. The absence of acknowledgement remained consistent. And consistency over time becomes a message. Whether intentional or not, it signaled that nothing had changed. For the other party, that confirmed that the boundary was still justified. What makes this story resonate is how relatable it is beyond Hollywood. Many people have experienced a moment where trust was broken quietly, without drama, and never repaired. No explosion. No apology. Just distance. Seeing that dynamic play out between public figures reminds audiences that fame doesn't insulate people from deeply human experiences. It only makes them harder to explain publicly. By this stage, the resentment wasn't active hostility. It was resolved distance, a conscious choice to keep paths separate, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And when you understand it that way, the narrative shifts. It's no longer about hatred. It's about boundaries that were drawn for a reason and never erased. By the time this tension became noticeable to outsiders, it had already settled into something permanent. There was no drama left in it, no emotional volatility. What remained was a quiet certainty. The kind that comes when someone has replayed a situation enough times to understand it fully and decided, without hesitation, that reopening it would only lead backward. In that sense, the resentment wasn't reactive anymore. It was resolved. Those who knew him well noticed a clear pattern. He didn't speak negatively about Rob Reiner, nor did he attempt to influence how others viewed him. There were no public jabs, no subtle digs in interviews, no attempts to rewrite history. Instead, there was refusal. Refusal to engage. Refusal to collaborate. Refusal to pretend the past didn't happen. That kind of restraint often gets misunderstood. But it usually signals something deeper than anger. It signals closure without reconciliation. What made the situation especially final was the way it shaped future decisions. Opportunities that would have made sense professionally were quietly passed over. Shared spaces were navigated carefully, if at all. It wasn't about avoidance out of fear. It was avoidance out of clarity. The decision had already been made internally, long before anyone else noticed. And once someone reaches that level of clarity, persuasion becomes irrelevant. There's also an emotional maturity in recognizing when an explanation no longer matters. Early on, there may have been hope for understanding or acknowledgement. But as time went on, the need for validation faded. The facts were already known internally. Waiting for an apology or recognition would have meant giving the other person power over emotional resolution. Choosing not to wait was an act of self-preservation. Industry insiders have described this as one of those rare Hollywood divides that never healed because neither side truly tried to fix it. Not out of arrogance, but out of incompatibility in values. One side operated comfortably within unspoken rules and shifting dynamics. The other believed respect required transparency and accountability. When those two philosophies collide, the result isn't always conflict. Sometimes it's separation. What's striking is how little this affected outward success. Careers didn't stall. Reputations didn't suffer. If anything, both men continued to thrive independently. That's important because it removes the usual motivations people assign to long-term resentment. There was nothing to gain from holding on to it and nothing to lose by letting it go. Which means the choice to maintain distance wasn't strategic, it was principled. Over time, that principle became part of identity. Not in a loud way, but in a guiding one. It influenced how future collaborations were evaluated, how trust was extended, and how power dynamics were navigated. Once someone has been quietly sidelined or dismissed, they rarely allow themselves to be in that position again. The lesson sticks, even when the people involved fade into the background. From the outside, it might look extreme to maintain such distance for so long. But from the inside, it likely felt necessary. Peace often comes not from resolution, but from alignment, aligning actions with values and refusing to compromise them for convenience. That alignment can look like coldness to others, but internally it brings stability. By this point, the resentment no longer needed justification. It existed simply because the original breach was never repaired, and the conditions that caused it never changed. That's the part most people miss. Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it just makes the truth easier to live with. When you stretch the timeline out and look at the full arc of what happened, the situation stops feeling dramatic and starts feeling deliberate. The resentment toward Rob Reiner didn't survive because it was constantly being fed. It survived because it was never challenged in a meaningful way. There was no moment of accountability, no effort to clarify intentions, and no acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Over time, that absence became its own answer. And once that answer settled in, there was nothing left to discuss. What many people misunderstand is that distance doesn't always come from anger. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that a relationship did not operate on equal footing. Acceptance that respect was assumed but not reciprocated. Acceptance that reopening the door would only lead back to the same imbalance. For someone who had already processed the situation internally, continuing to keep that distance wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a rational decision rooted in self-respect. In Hollywood, unresolved issues are often buried under polite smiles and forced reunions. But that wasn't the path taken here. There was no interest in symbolic gestures or public reconciliation. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because forgiveness without understanding can feel hollow. Moving on didn't require repairing the relationship. It required protecting personal boundaries. And once those boundaries were in place, they became non-negotiable. What also kept this divide intact was consistency. Years passed, opportunities came and went, and still nothing changed. That consistency sends a powerful message. It says the issue wasn't circumstantial or emotional. It was foundational. Something about how trust was handled early on altered the way the relationship was viewed forever. When trust shifts at that level, time doesn't soften it. It simply makes the decision easier to live with. Rob Reiner's lack of public response or clarification only reinforced that conclusion. Silence in this context wasn't neutral. It echoed the original problem. Decisions made without dialogue, actions taken without explanation. Whether intentional or not, that pattern never changed. And when patterns repeat over decades, they stop being coincidences. They become confirmations. From the outside, it may seem extreme to maintain such distance for so long. But internally, it often brings peace. Knowing where you stand. Knowing what you won't tolerate again. Knowing that you don't owe continued access to someone who once dismissed your value. That kind of clarity doesn't require hostility to sustain itself. It survives on principle alone. This is why the reaction never softened, even with age and hindsight. Not because the feeling was still raw, but because it had been resolved. There was no lingering hope, no unfinished conversation waiting to happen. The decision had already been made and proven correct by time. Reopening it would have served no purpose except to revisit something already understood. So when people say he utterly hated Rob Reiner, they're missing the deeper truth. Hatred burns hot and demands attention. What existed here was colder, quieter, and far more final. It was the recognition that respect, once compromised, doesn't always get rebuilt. And when someone reaches that realization, distance stops being emotional. It becomes permanent.